Jujutsu Kaisen and Naruto are home to some of the most well-beloved and simultaneously controversial antagonists in battle shonen, the best examples of which being Sukuna and Madara. Two characters with captivating screen presence, overwhelming power that forces our protagonists to join forces, but extremely divisive conclusions that many are a fan of, and because of this, it isn't an exaggeration to call them a mixed bag in the eyes of Jujutsu Kaisen and Naruto fans. Today, I want to analyze them, not only as individual villains that push the story forward, but also respective raid bosses for their manga. What similarities do these antagonists share? What writing decisions contribute to their differences? What about their conclusions rub people the wrong way? Throughout this video, I'll be breaking down these antagonist narratives in order to understand what makes them so iconic and such exemplary depictions of the raid boss villain archetype. When making a comparison like this, one of the most important things you can do is take note of the ways in which these two aspects align. And if you're looking, you'll find a litany of fascinatingly similar traits between these two characters, traits that make them so widely enjoyed. Aside from the basic desire for comparison that is especially rampant in anime and manga spaces, Madara and Sukuna were compared quite often at the height of Jujutsu Kaisen's popularity and Sukuna's notoriety, in part because of their many notable similarities. Take the respective hype allotted to them throughout Jujutsu Kaisen and Naruto alike. In Jujutsu Kaisen's case, Sukuna's overwhelming power and skill with sorcery is set as an expectation from the outset. Even manifesting a fraction of his power is enough to grant random curses the highest grade of strength imaginable, and for a vessel like Itadori, it makes him a threat to the entire world as we know it. Whether it be him incarnating into Itadori's flesh for a brief rampage, or him merely looking down on a curse that dared to touch his soul, Sukuna's presence in the story adds an immediate level of tension and stress that cannot truly be compared to any other in this manga. The King of Curses, the Honored One, a Calamity, these are all titles that Sukuna is known by, designations that only successfully capture a fraction of his true terror and might. Gege does an amazing job consistently building Sukuna's mythological strength and nature, and in doing so, creates an antagonist whose presence seems a tier above the rest of the cast. In a similar fashion, once the name Madara is first uttered within the story, it is said with reverence, fear, or hatred that is meant to represent the presence and impact of a shinobi such as he. While we aren't privy to seeing Madara's power in the flesh till we're well over 70% of the way through the series, his mere name evokes power. So much so that seemingly untamable beasts like Kurama fear and despise his Sharingan. In characters on the level of Obito, an Uchiha capable of subjugating the Nine Tails at the age of 14, wield his name in order to declare war on the entire shinobi world. Sukuna and Madara, in the current age, exist as relics of force drawn from the past to haunt the future. Preeminent figures that act as massive obstacles for the main cast. Both of them revere and respect strength in some capacity, even when the person they are fighting clearly doesn't exist within the same realm as them. Another similarity that leads to a similar vibe between these two antagonists. Madara displays this respect when fighting the Five Kage, congratulating them for their ability to cooperate with their unique skill sets. At the same time, he mocks them for their weaknesses, flexing his terrifying strength. And whether it be a curse spirit like Jogo, a Shikigami like Maharaga, or a fledgling sorcerer like Higuruma or Megami, Sukuna is truly impartial to who he grants his praise, only desiring to taste the unique flavors of humanity and Jujutsu until he eventually dies. The only person Sukuna does not grant this respect to is Yuji. I find it very fitting that these two characters not only have a level of respect for those who are able to cultivate their own techniques in jutsu, but also have a deep-rooted desire to experience the thrill of battle themselves. The early warring periods of Naruto and the Heian era of Jujutsu Kaisen are highlighted as particularly violent and barbaric points in time. While violence of both modern eras is prominent and consistently seen, it is directed through political lenses and subterfuge that just isn't as highlighted in these past time periods. Living in an era where violence is currency, it only makes sense that the strongest of that period would find so much value in the ability to demonstrate one's strength. Jujutsu Kaisen is a world chock full of sorcerers and curses who love battle for very specific reasons, and even still, Sukuna stands out in his yearning for battle. There's a thrill in beating opponents and dominating them, and when put heavily on the back foot, Sukuna very rarely changes his demeanor, accepting death as a very possible outcome for all of his fights. Madara too has an appreciation for combat. You don't see it as consistently, or rather as explicitly in his fights, especially during his time as an Edo Tensei, but upon being revived in the flesh, we see that it's all he can do to contain his excitement. A physical body to feel pain, real blood that can surge through that body, and a beating heart that pounds with excitement and exhilaration are all prerequisites for Madara to fully immerse himself within a fight. Anything else can hardly even be considered one. His fight with Guy resembles Sukuna's general demeanor in regards to his battle lust the most. A scrap that leaves half of Madara's body burning, his physical skills overwhelmed and on the doorstep of death itself, and yet he smiles. Madara, congratulating Guy on his performance, crowns him as the strongest taijutsu user he's ever fought, and in his own way tries to show his gratitude for the great performance by finishing him off with the effect of the 8 gates does. On the surface, it's these traits that endeared many fans to both Sukuna and Madara. Their intimidating presence, exceptional buildup, and decimation of their opponent's resolve scream aura and villainy in a way that's hard to hate. They are extremely similar up to a certain point. The scaffolding previously described is the biggest contributor to their mainstream appeal in a sea of villains and antagonists. Balancing tension, release, anticipation, and follow-through is quite simple in concept, but very few authors are able to do so with the effectiveness of Gege and Kishimoto. Sukuna and Madara are calamitous threats that are unstoppable, and relish in that fact when finally released from their constraints. Sukuna was, and arguably still is, on track to reach Madara's iconic status, but it was during the heart of Sukuna Kaisen where I noticed that people's perspectives, and even my own, starting to shift, and larger disparities forming between specific camps of Jujutsu Kaisen fans. Some coming to relish in Gege's approach to the character, appreciating Sukuna for past rampages like a Shibuya Massacre, and later chaotic battles like Shinjuku Showdown, while others despised it and saw figures like Madara as the way to properly write this kind of antagonist. The path that Madara went down as a villain and as a fellow runner of a series gauntlet isn't the one Sukuna traveled, and in this next segment, I'd like to further explore that concept and how Gege and Kishimoto start to deviate from each other in terms of approach. In establishing what makes these antagonists so different, viewing Madara's path as the standard and Sukuna's as the deviation helps put their relative relationship into perspective. Whether it is sensical or not, Jujutsu Kaisen will always be compared to its predecessor, Naruto, which has already left its mark on the world. Even the very foundation of Sukuna and Madara's roles as antagonists, while similar in format, is quite different in terms of its function, and I don't think this is often considered when making a comparison like this. Madara is in no way meant to be the final villain of Naruto. Even ignoring Kaguya and Black Zetsu's involvement in his defeat, Sasuke and Naruto's final clash was always going to be what concluded this epic saga of shinobi conflict. In the same way, some sort of confrontation with Yuji and Megumi would always be a part of Sukuna's. As opposed to Madara, who was yet another stepping stone in the long line of hate and vengeance, Sukuna was meant to be a complete culmination of Jujutsu Kaisen's core ideas in one body. So in role alone, Madara is actually more similar to Kenjaku than he is Sukuna. Both some of the greatest influences on the worlds that they inhabit. Both manipulators that constructed favorable scenarios to their own ends, and both villains that could have been the final wall for the protagonist under significantly different circumstances. Despite fooling so many people, it's arguably just as obvious with Madara as it was with Kenjaku that he wouldn't be Naruto's final antagonist. Throughout the entire war arc, Kishimoto cleverly pulls us through the history of ninja by having each subsequent section of the war focus on a character that exists further and further in the past. Initially, it's Kabuto, and how his obsession with Orochimaru and lack of identity impacts his actions today. Obito is the subsequent focus, thrusting us into a feud that originated several decades ago. And then we are thrust a century into the past, when it's time for us to learn more about Madara and witness how he played a hand in all of the bloodshed seen during this time and the future. Now, if he were meant to be the end-all be-all of hatred, the cyclical nature of war, and the incompatibility of humans and peace, then he wouldn't have been stabbed by Zetsu. He too wouldn't have been a direct victim of someone's engineered plan, and yet he was. The thing is, the past isn't the main focus of Naruto. It is only what informs the present and the cycles that we explore that have been shaped today. Naruto and Sasuke's story is one that represents two young men learning from those who came before and arriving at different answers. Their fight a climactic display of their proclamations of truth. Madara is merely another piece on the board, both from the perspective of an important historical figure and as an antagonist. He's not exactly a pawn, but a rook or bishop. Sukuna, in contrast, is obviously set up to be the final wall of the Jujutsu Kaisen manga. The first chapter of this series is titled Ryomen Sukuna. He is someone that predates any other antagonist in the manga and is focused on so much more explicitly than his Naruto counterpart. Rather than going for the long build-up and anticipatory writing style exclusively, Gege allows Sukuna's presence to steal the show in short bursts of chapters before his final run. His fight against the Finger Bearer and Megami, and more famously, his rampage in Shibuya, are the most notable examples of this in action. These small outbursts lead into the dominance with which he grips the story from chapter 212 on, making everything prior feel like a rehearsal. Not only is he the strongest character in the entire story, but his viewpoint for a large portion of JJK is framed as the correct one, the proper path to power in the world of sorcerers and curses, even though he doesn't prop himself up as an ideologue like Madara. In having final villain privileges, Sukuna's most prominent relationships must exist with Jujutsu Kaisen central characters, Yuji, Gojo, and Megami, all reflections or rejections of his worldview. Yuji and Sukuna's battle is the climax of Jujutsu Kaisen because these two characters hold diametrically opposed beliefs about humanity and the importance of it. In contrast to a character like Yuji Itadori, Sukuna holds no values, he has no ideals, he has no intention aside from acting in a way that befits his nature and battling with sorcerers to experience the pleasure of it. As a result of this fact, the life of a single individual means less than nothing. To even call it an obstacle for him would be a grave exaggeration. The inherent incongruity in these two's worldviews demands that they clash with one another and do battle, just as Naruto and Sasuke must fight because of their perspectives on bonds. Yuji hates Sukuna because he doesn't value life at all. Sukuna hates Yuji because despite his weakness, he clings to it stubbornly. His unbreakable will makes Sukuna uncomfortable because it reveals that he too could have lived a different life. It's why he wishes to destroy Itadori and everything that he stands for so completely. If that unbreakable will can be broken, shattered, decimated, then it means that he too never had anything to worry about. There was no other path he could have possibly taken. Now, to say Sukuna, the King of Curses, has no unique point of view as the strongest sorcerer in history would be incorrect, but as he states himself, he has no ideals. He never needed to, because of his power. Anything he desired could have been achieved through his overwhelming strength, so a will that was equally powerful was redundant. For Sukuna, to have something as flimsy as values would be fruitless, and it is in all of Sukuna's abundance where he most differs from Madara Uchiha. A man who, despite having godlike powers himself, could never achieve all it is that he desired. A man who is regularly confronted with the cruelty of reality, the oxymoronic nature of human beings in peace, and a level of strength that surpassed even his own. In a world where his current power wasn't enough, Madara had to develop an ideal, one that he would achieve through underhanded means. The infinite Tsukiyomi was the only way Madara thought he could achieve his aims, a dream world where nothing bad could possibly happen, an endless genjutsu where the victims are finally allowed to decide their fate. It is actually because he valued life so much, loved his family with all of his heart, and tried his best to bring about change himself that he causes so much death and destruction. The contradiction of peace and violence lies within Madara's heart as well, but he does want to bring about a world where his twisted form of happiness and freedom can exist. As is implied in his post-mortem conversation with Mahito, we see that Sukuna had opportunities to become a significantly different individual than the one we see in the narrative. A version of himself that didn't just kill and destroy until that same fate befell him. Madara's failure was choosing to change the world through manipulation and violence, to attempt to completely alter the course of history alone. Sukuna's failure was not choosing a path at all. Aside from the fundamental roles they are intended to fulfill, it is this difference in ideals that set them so far apart within the context of their stories and people's reactions to them. Because the tragedy of Sukuna's past is vague, only implied or commented on a few times, people are much less willing to engage with what is there. There is no engagement with what Sukuna is, only a desire to know what led him to this point. And while that's okay with a character like Madara, Someone whose past exists in such explicit detail due to a mix of Kishimoto's heavy-handed writing style and the theme of repeating history, this approach to analysis doesn't work as effectively for Sukuna, a villain who doesn't have parallels that connect him to the cast via their history. Instead, he's meant to be contended with as is. A pure villain who thinks life has no intrinsic value and the will within the weak has no meaning. In order to once again further analyze these characters and the mixed feelings had about them, I have to explore their most controversial moments, which, fortunate enough for me, both happen to be in their conclusions within Naruto and Jujutsu Kaisen. This is the panel that killed Madara. Not just in the story, but in the hearts and minds of every Naruto fan when they came across it. A controversial death, to say the least. Sukuna's defeat is quite controversial as well, and Nobara's contribution to his demise is a pretty big part of that. Just like with Zetsu, the initial reaction to this twist wasn't one of coolness or a positive surprise, but a pretty universal facepalm. As someone who believed in Nobara's return and wanted it to happen, the convenience of her waking up, getting filled in about the plan, and successfully using resonance on Sukuna's final finger with success was almost too much to bear in such quick succession. It doesn't deal the final blow to Sukuna, but it impedes him from opening his domain and killing Itadori, and thus is instrumental to his defeat. In both Madara and Sukuna's case, the name of the game here is contrivance, one stemming from a bait-and-switch penultimate antagonist, and the other coming from a character whose return was long overdue. As time has passed, I've grown more fond of Zetsu's betrayal and what that represents for Madara. Both his deaths being a direct result of letting someone take his back is powerful. The weakness we saw described in his flashback haunting him once more. His inability to trust anyone but his own shadow, resulting in that very shadow turning against him as well. I do see the comedy in this twist, and while I do think Kishimoto could have done more to foreshadow greater machinations for Black Zetsu, the emotional core of this moment remains intact for me. Unfortunately, I can't say the same thing for Sukuna's loss, or at least one of the key components leading up to it. With Gege, as is typical for my gripes with the story, I love the idea, but wince at the execution. The core trio all contributing to taking down Sukuna is something that on some level anyone could have predicted, but the spontaneity of Kugasaki's contribution throws the entire recipe off. Neither confirming nor denying her condition until it was absolutely necessary just doesn't lead to a very palatable or satisfying resolution to that dangling thread. It also doesn't help that the final conversation between Sukuna and Megumi, and later, Sukuna and Yuji, are crammed into the first portion of a chapter that seems so preoccupied with moving the story along. There is no sense of pageantry in these pages, no real finality, no impact, just hollow feeling words before we are pulled into a tonal and narrative whiplash. If these two pages represented the absolute end for these characters, I would feel a much deeper sense of dissatisfaction than I do today. While the moments of their defeat don't feel entirely sound, it is when we see these two characters reflect on their lives and deaths that Kishimoto and Gege are somehow able to recover and stick the landing. And I think the controversiality of the manner in which they're defeated is something that is par for the course with raid bosses in a serialized work such as this. For Madara, it is a short but heartfelt conversation with his best friend, a rehashing of the way they lived their lives, and it's as he's lying down unable to fight for himself or his ambitions that he better understands Hashirama's aims. What defeated Madara was not Hashirama, his best friend and eternal rival, but his will and passion that was passed down through generations, strengthening and coalescing until its force was greater than that of anything that a single person could have ever hoped to accomplish. To create a world without war and suffering, patience is required, in understanding that you will not get to enjoy all of the fruits of the trees you planted. Accepting this and persevering anyway is what allowed the will of fire to burn bright after the first Hokage's death. Sukuna gets a final conversation as well. As he passes on, he is confronted by Mahito about how he lived, and Sukuna is forced to come to grips with the fact that his path of destruction was one he too could have strayed from. To care for Arame without worry of their curses, valuing their lives without need to burn everything around him to cinder. This too was a road he could have walked. Itadori's resilient and unbreakable will, the will that Sukuna found so pointless, would have allowed for him to choose life. It might have allowed him to be happier in the face of his curse. Learning from his defeat and walking a new path with Arame is the last we see of Sukuna, the loser of this battle, graciously accepting his loss. I'm quite a big fan of these final conversations. Two villains who had not known something as meager as vulnerability before this didn't have a chance to have such defenseless conversations, finally allowed to do so in their final moments. The strength they had cultivated worn away, leaving only the people beneath. Kishimoto and Gege, for all of their stumbling and missteps, were able to create domineering, charismatic characters that could test the wills of their opponents and reflect on themselves in their greatest moments of insecurity. And it's why I think Sukuna and Madara are such iconic and great examples of raid bosses in anime and manga.